In a grand hall lined with gold-trimmed curtains and polished marble floors, men in suits exchanged smiles sharpened by politics. Laughter echoed through the air, rehearsed and hollow. Behind every handshake, an agenda. Behind every compliment, calculation. And yet, in that very room, true power stood quietly in the shadows. He wore no suit, no tie, no polished shoes. Just a plain military uniform, slightly faded at the edges, and boots worn from the weight of walking beside the people. He did not command attention, not by voice, not by stature. Not yet. Eyes glanced past him like he was furniture. A junior, officer perhaps, a driver, maybe a security escort, someone unimportant, someone without a name. He stood still, observing, listening, unshaken. They laughed near him, dismissed him. Some even brushed past him with the kind of indifference reserved for ghosts. They did not know that this quiet man, this seemingly misplaced soldier, was the President of Burkina Faso. One delegate scoffed under his breath. Another rolled his eyes, questioning what someone like that was doing in a place like this. But he said nothing. Not yet. Because true power does not announce itself with noise. It waits for the right moment, and then speaks so that the world must listen. There was a time when kings were crowned with trumpets. Now some of the strongest leaders walk in silence, testing the hearts of men by how they treat those they believe are beneath them. And on that day, in that room full of prideful men, no one noticed that they had just disrespected the leader of a nation, the symbol of a movement, the face of a revolution. They saw the uniform. They saw the youth. They saw what they wanted to see. But what they missed was Ibrahim Traoré. Before the world whispered his name with awe, before the cameras turned, before the headlines screamed, "Youngest leader in the world," there was silence. He was not born into luxury, not carved from elite bloodlines or political dynasties. Ibrahim Traoré came from the soil, humble, strong, and rooted. He was born in 1988 in the dusty town of Bondoukoui, a name most would never know, until it gave rise to a man who would change a nation. His childhood was not defined by toys or comfort, but by observation. He watched his people suffer quietly beneath broken systems. He saw farmers bend their backs to a sun that gave little in return. He watched mothers ration meals while politicians dined behind closed doors. And in that silence, something began to grow. Not bitterness, not rage, but purpose. As a child, he asked questions no one could answer. Why must we live like this? Why do our leaders speak only when it suits them? Why is justice always delayed, if it ever comes at all? While others ran after fame or fortune, Traoré chased understanding. He found it in books, in conversations with elders, and in the bitter truths spoken under stars in quiet villages. He chose discipline early, the path of the soldier, not for war, not for glory, but for service, for protection, for structure in a nation constantly being pulled apart by greed and outside influence. At the University of Ouagadougou, he studied science, the mechanics of the world. He was sharp, focused, but never loud. Those who knew him then say he spoke only when necessary. And when he did, people listened. Joining the army was never about status. It was about standing between the people and the chaos. He trained with precision, led with humility. In Mali, during joint operations, his fellow soldiers saw his calm, under fire. He was the kind of leader who would share his rations before taking a bite, who walked beside the last man, not in front of the first. But still, he watched. The leadership above him was drifting, aloof, corrupt, and disconnected from the country's pain. He remained loyal, patient, but that fire inside him, it never dimmed. It only learned to wait. And then came the moment, the betrayal of the people by those who were supposed to serve them. The streets filled with protests, The cries for change grew louder. Fear spread through the halls of power. The foundation was cracking. It was no longer a question of if, but when, and who would dare step forward. The soldier from Bondoukoui did not step forward for fame. He did not want to rule, but he could no longer stand by while the nation bled under those unfit to lead. And so, he stepped into history, but not with fanfare. Not with parades, with resolve, with quiet fire, with the weight of a people behind him, and the courage to face what lay ahead. This was no ordinary soldier. This was no pawn. This was Ibrahim Traoré, and he was not finished yet. Burkina Faso was bleeding. Once a land of promise, it had become a battleground of broken dreams. Armed groups crept through the northern sands like shadows, terrorizing villages, torching homes and silencing voices. The people cried out, not just for protection, but for someone who would listen, someone who would act. But the palace in Ouagadougou stood silent. Leadership, once a sacred duty, had rotted into a performance, all speeches and no spine. The state, strangled by fear and foreign interests, had forgotten the faces in the fields, the cries in the markets, the widows burying their sons in shallow graves. Inside the military, the frustration boiled like a storm held back by sandbags. Soldiers were dying, civilians were screaming, but the chain of command remained frozen, paralyzed by bureaucracy and cowardice. And then came a whisper. Not from a general, not from a politician, from a captain. Young, disciplined, resolute. Ibrahim Traoré. He did not come with tanks. He came with truth. He did not call for violence. He called for vision, a new direction, a leadership that stood with the people, not above them. When he spoke, men stopped to listen, not because of his rank, but because of his righteousness. Then, on September 30th, 2022, the dam broke. Soldiers took to the streets, not in chaos but in purpose. They did not chant for conquest. They marched for change. The people, worn and weary, looked up, and for the first time in years they saw hope wearing camouflage. Shots were not fired in rage, but in rejection. Rejection of the old guard, of leaders who had betrayed the oath to protect. The coup was swift, bloodless, surgical, and at its center stood the young captain with a steady gaze. When the dust settled, the man before the microphones was not an eager politician drunk on power. It was a soldier with fire in his heart and a nation on his shoulders. He did not declare himself a king. He declared his responsibility. He stood before the nation and said, "The fight for our people is not over. We must take our destiny into our own hands. We must rebuild what was lost and reclaim what was stolen." He spoke like the ancestors were watching, like the children yet to be born were listening. And in that moment, the world was forced to ask, who is this man? No fancy title, no decades in parliament, just a captain. Now president, the youngest head of state in the world, at just 34 years old. But this was not about age. This was about clarity, about conviction, about a man who did not wait for permission to do what was right. He did not rise through corruption. He rose through courage, and in doing so, he became something rare, something dangerous to the powerful, and precious to the powerless. He became a symbol of resistance, of restoration, of revolution. Not everyone celebrated. The international community shifted uneasily. Foreign powers who once whispered in the ears of leaders found a wall in Ibrahim Traoré. He spoke of sovereignty, of kicking open the doors long held shut by colonial fingerprints. He refused to bow to Western interests, refused to sell his country's dignity for aid wrapped in chains. He spoke not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa, an Africa tired of being exploited, an Africa ready to stand tall. And that is when the world truly took notice, not just of the man, but of the movement he had ignited. He was not perfect. He was not polished, but he was real. And real leaders are rare, especially in a world drowning in pretenders. The room was still humming with ego, Suits sparkled under chandeliers. Glasses clinked in rehearsed celebration. The air reeked of diplomacy, sweet on the surface, bitter underneath. Every conversation was a negotiation, every smile a trap, and still, he stood in the corner. Unmoved, unbothered, unseen. Ibrahim Traoré had not spoken a word. He let the world reveal itself. The arrogance, the assumptions, the deep, unshakable belief that power always looked a certain way. To them, he was just another face in uniform. But behind his silence, history waited to speak. Then, it happened. A hush swept across the hall like a storm breaking the sky. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. The lights dimmed, cameras turned toward the stage, and the voice echoed across the chamber like thunder. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for His Excellency, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The words dropped like bombs. Glasses froze in midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes snapped toward the corner, the one they had ignored. The man they had brushed past. The figure they had dismissed, and he began to walk, slowly, calmly, purposefully, not like a man basking in revenge, but like a leader walking in truth. Each step shattered a prejudice. Each footfall silenced a whisper. The faces that once looked past him now strained to catch a glimpse. The very hands that refused to greet him now reached forward in desperation. And yet, he did not gloat. There was no smirk. No spite, only strength. He took the stage, not with theatrics, but with gravity. The same young man who had been disrespected only moments ago now stood taller than every king and diplomat in the room. Not because of power, but because of purpose. And, when he finally spoke, the room held its breath. He did not scold them. He did not curse them. He simply spoke of Africa, of dignity, of the forgotten, of the youth, of the power of nations that refused to be pawns any longer. He spoke not like a politician, but like a mirror, reflecting everything they had refused to see. And in that moment, every insult became a lesson. Every assumption became a wound, because they had disrespected a man, not knowing they were standing in the presence of history. Narrator, VO. He was not just the president of Burkina Faso. He was the voice of every child who had ever been told they were too small, the face of every soldier who stood with honor when no one was watching, the name that would one day be written in the same breath as Thomas Sankara, and every giant who ever dared to shake the world awake. Ibrahim Traoré. He did not rise through approval. He rose through truth, and now the world was listening. Some revolutions are loud. They arrive with gunfire, flames, and broken statues. Others arrive in silence, in the defiance of a man who refuses to kneel, in the quiet courage of a leader who walks alone. Ibrahim Traoré's rise was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of something greater, a movement not bound by borders or flags, but by spirit. Burkina Faso, under his command, began to change, not overnight, not with ease, but with intention. He stripped away the layers of corruption like peeling rot from a tree. He restructured the military, not to oppress but to protect. He spoke directly to the people, without middlemen, without masks, and they listened because they saw themselves in him. But this was never just about one nation. Africa had watched, from the sidelines for too long, its leaders silenced, its resources stolen, its people conditioned to believe they must always ask before they act. But Ibrahim Traoré, he did not ask. He declared. He cut ties with colonial powers who had long wrapped aid in chains. He questioned the presence of foreign troops who claimed to protect but delivered little. He stood firm in front of cameras that had humiliated his ancestors, and spoke in a voice that could not be edited out. He told the world, "We will no longer be the playground of empires. We are not your charity, we are your equals." and that shook the ground. Other nations watched. Leaders whispered. Youth across the continent looked up and saw more than a man in uniform. They saw permission. Permission to rise. Permission to believe again. From Mali to Niger, the winds of change caught fire. Flags of unity waved where only fear had ruled. Young people chanted his name, not as a politician, but as a symbol. Traoré, Traoré, Traoré. He became more than president. He became a flame, and those who benefit from silence began to panic. The media tried to twist the story, paint him as a threat, a rebel, a rogue. But the truth had already reached the villages, the cities, the diaspora, and no headline could unwrite what the people had already seen. A leader who did not sell them out, a man who stood up when everyone else sat down. They tried to isolate him, threaten him, tempt him. But Traoré had made his choice long before the presidency. He was not in this for applause. He was in it for liberation. Even as pressures mounted, even as threats emerged from shadows in global boardrooms, he never blinked, because the mission was never about him. It was about the farmers with calloused hands, the mothers who fed nations, with empty wallets, the youth who had talent but no tools. He walked among them, ate with them, trained with his soldiers, and never, never forgot where he came from. That is the true revolution, not just taking power, but transforming it, making it mean something. And so the story continues. With each decision he makes, Traoré rewrites the expectations of leadership. With each speech, he dares to speak the truths others hide behind polished lies. And while the world debates his methods, one fact remains unshakable. He is not owned, not by the West, not by fear, not by the weight of tradition. He is owned only by the people and his duty to them. And that, more than any weapon, any army, or any throne, is what makes him unstoppable. Burkina Faso stands on the edge of something new, something bold, and behind it stands a man once mocked, once overlooked, once disrespected. But now they say his name with caution, with admiration, with respect. Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier, a servant, a symbol, a storm. This is not the story of how a young captain became a president. It is the story of how a nation found its voice through the quiet strength of one man. A revolution not of bullets, but of belief. And to those who disrespected him before they knew his name, they know it now.